I'm happy to be here, and I think I'd probably be even happier to be in Knoxville. But given the circumstances, I think we're all doing our part and trying to control the spread of this pandemic. But I suppose there's sort of a silver lining, right? That we're all probably using a lot less energy, and so there's probably pluses and minuses. But I do wish it is a pity I'm not there in Knoxville, and but happy to be able to connect to you guys anyway. Before I start in, there's the one other thing I wanted to mention was earlier in the day, Suzanne organized a chat with graduate students where I was telling them, able to explain what it's like to be a government research scientist. And one thing that I thought might be relevant to mention is that I didn't mention, but I think maybe is interesting to people, is for me, the role that synthesis centers like Nimbus have played. I know in my own career that working as a government research scientist, the sort of downside is it's very isolated and not very stimulating environment. And collaborating via synthesis centers like Nimbus and NCES and Succinct, for me, has been just like a total game changer with my career and my collaborations. And basically everything, pretty much all of my research, you can track it back to working groups at one synthesis center or another. So I really have a special affinity for Nimbus and the other synthesis centers because of that. So I'm going to be talking about insect invasions, and sort of taking a big picture look at insect invasions. My background is with forest insects, but after a while, I've sort of come to realize, well, forest insects are just part of a larger problem, and that's biological invasions in general. And insects in general haven't really received that much attention compared to many organisms. So it's interesting to consider, well, what is really driving these invasions of insects worldwide? The problem of biological invasions, and specifically of insects, is something that's really happening all over the world. That this is just some data on numbers of non-native forest insects in the US, Europe, and New Zealand. You can see very similar trajectories in all these regions, and with data from other areas, I think show very similar patterns. That somewhere around 1860 or so, light went on, and we started accidentally moving organisms around the world. This is the same data just for the United States. And one important thing to remember about invasions in general, but especially insect invasions, is that most of the majority of insect invasions are slightly inconsequential, or at least we don't know of any adverse impacts they're having. And most species for example, in the United States, we have somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 species of non-native insects that are established here. This graph just shows forest insects, but many of those, probably most of them, are actually quite rare. But a significant fraction, for forest insects, about 1/5, are known to cause some sort of significant damage. And that's why the whole problem of invasions are a problem, is that there are an extraordinary number of non-native insects that cause problems to society and in nature. A good example of that is provided by the emerald ash borer, which is many of you probably have heard about the emerald ash borer, but right now it's probably the most serious forest insect, non-native insect in North America. That we think that it was accidentally introduced maybe in the early 1990s with wood packaging material somewhere near, was probably brought in somewhere near Detroit, Michigan. And it's been gradually expanding its range ever since. And in areas, it's a good example of sort of a lack of coevolution with native communities, that this insect is native to East Asia. And in East Asia, like many bark and wood-boring insects, it only colonizes trees that are in the process of dying, dead and dying trees. But in North America, where the species has no prior evolutionary contact, the ash species we have here, we have 22 species of ash, and none of them exhibit any serious resistance to this insect. And so instead of the insect being limited to dead and dying trees, the insect can colonize and kill perfectly healthy trees. And so the impacts that this insect is having are phenomenal, that we're seeing the vast majority of host ash trees are being killed by the emerald ash borer. And so it's having a rather transformative effect on forest ecosystems. So, but looking at the big problem that in the United States, we have somewhere around 70 non-native forest insect species, damaging non-native forest insect species. And you can see this is a distribution of counties where those species, these damaging species, are known to be established. And you can see it's a rather non-random distribution, that there's a preponderance of establishments in the eastern and northeastern United States. So one of the questions that always, when I show this map, is why, and it's a rather logical question. And I'm jumping the gun. I'll talk about the why question in a little bit, but before moving on to that, I wanted to just say a little bit more about the impacts of non-native insects. And again, my knowledge is mostly goes back to forest insects, and we know, for example, insect species like the emerald ash borer are causing over $2 billion in damages a year just to homeowners and municipalities that have to pay for the cost of removing dead trees, and the cost associated with the loss of amenity trees in urban plantings. And of course, the other types of impacts of economic impacts of insects that are phenomenal, of course, are impacts on agriculture, impacts on human health, because of being vectors of diseases. But we often pay less attention to ecosystem impacts that aren't necessarily as easily translated into economic impacts. And this is some data from a recent paper where we attempted to estimate the total impact of non-native insects and diseases in the United States. We have this extraordinarily large number of damaging species, things like emerald ash borer, but also Haemophilus deligate, beach bark disease. And basically what we estimated were the impacts that these species are having on carbon in the United States. And we were able to use forest inventory data to compare tree mortality rates in areas that have been invaded versus those where they haven't invaded. And we came up with an estimate of around 7 teragrams of carbon that are lost every year as a result of tree killing. This is basically above background levels of tree mortality, but that you can attribute to non-native insects and diseases in the United States. And just to kind of put that in a comparable range, that's somewhere in the same ballpark of the total impacts of wildfires every year in the United States. So it's a significant issue in terms of nutrient cycling and other ecosystem properties that are valued to societies in general. So, and probably in many cases, I tend to think that in many cases we probably don't know, we don't really understand many of the ecological impacts, the ecosystem level impacts of a lot of non-native insects, just because the species that cause spectacular tree mortality, it's harder to miss those, but some of the more subtle impacts on nutrient cycling and that sort of thing are things that we may take us much longer to understand. So with the remainder of my talk, I was going to kind of concentrate on these 3 areas of patterns of insect invasions and how the historical patterns of insect invasions we can learn about the drivers, what's really causing, what are the reasons why these invasions are happening in the first place. And the first thing I wanted to focus on were temporal patterns of historical insect invasions. Because I think I mentioned before that somewhere around the mid to 1800s or so is when, in most parts of the world, insects started to be moved around the world because presumably as a result of the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and associated with that was international trade. But when you look at different types of organisms, you often see quite different patterns of invasions. This graph shows numbers of invasions per decade for 3 groups of forest insects: sap feeders, wood borers, and foliage feeders. And you can see there are quite different patterns. The sap feeders and foliage feeders they reached their peak number of invasions in the early 1900s, and then generally sort of declined after that. Very different pattern for the bark and wood boring insects. You can see that the numbers of invasions has just shot up in the last few decades. What I want to mention about what explains these patterns is what we know about historical pathways for some of these organisms. Let's see, I'm having a little trouble advancing. Oh, here we go. In terms of insects in all parts of the world, we know that one of the main drivers historically of plant-feeding insects is world movement of plants. And if you were going to move a plant-feeding insect from one part of the world to another, you couldn't think of a better way to do it than by moving the plants that they feed on around with them, because then they have something to eat on during the journey, and when they get there, they have something to eat. So it's unfortunately an insidious problem. And it turns out, of course, that there's actually a large, historically, there's been a large trade in plants around the world. And so we know this is one of the main pathways. For forest insects, for insects in general, there are many, many pathways, but for forest insects, one of the most important pathways that we know about is international movement of wood. Things like pallets, very often they're made out of low quality wood. So that wood very often, because it's low quality, it may be made from a tree that was recently killed. And very often as a consequence may actually contain wood boring insects in it. And so we know that, and in fact, this is an analysis we did several years ago where we reconstructed the pathway by which most of the damaging forest insects in North America were believed to have entered, invaded. And so you can see for bark and wood boring insects, the wood is by far the main pathway. But for the other guilds, the sap feeding insects, foliage feeding insects, as well as pathogens, you can see that movement with plants is by far the dominant pathway for these species moving around. And so in terms of this information is critical really for understanding historical patterns of invasions. Because this is a slide that I showed earlier, you can see for the sap-feeding insects and the foliage-feeding insects, we know these species, they predominantly introduced with plants. And prior to 1912 in the United States, imports of plants was essentially unregulated. And there was an increasing and quite large business of importation of live plants mostly for landscaping, but also agricultural purposes that was going on. And it took time for the governments to recognize this problem. And so regulations that were put in place that greatly limited the problem. And you can see this really has been successful, not at stopping invasions probably of these types of organisms with plants, but greatly curtailing it. On the other hand, what you can see with the bark and wood boring insects is that this big increase in in numbers of invasions really has skyrocketed in the last few decades, and that can be attributed to the increased use of wood packaging material with containerized cargo. And so I think all of this really kind of probably quite nicely illustrates how the nature of the difficulty of managing invasions through biosecurity programs is that it unfortunately, we're often very slow to learn that some of these pathways even exist and that there's serious problems. Oftentimes there's quite a long lag time between when species arrive and when their damages is even noticed. So unfortunately, we have this record of, this plant pathway it took many years for us to realize that there was risk associated with it. The same thing happened with the wood packaging material that it wasn't until the early 2000s that this problem of wood packaging as an important pathway for invasions was recognized. And the International Plant Protection Convention took action and implemented a phytosanitary measure we call ISPM 15, which now requires all international trade of wood packaging material, things like pallets. It has to be heat treated or fumigated, and this we call it ISPM 15. It's not 100% effective, but it definitely has reduced numbers of pest invasions, and it's a good thing. But again, it's one of these things very often these actions are put in place after many species, rather than before, after many species have already invaded. So I want to switch gears a little bit and now talk about, again, patterns of historical insect invasions and relating those to trade. And we can consider both spatial patterns as well as temporal patterns. And these are some data from a recent paper we have on where we looked at large-scale biogeographic patterns of bark beetle invasions. These are what we call the Scolytines, and they're bark beetles that have moved around the world, and many of these are significant pests. And I show on this graph, these chord graphs are sometimes a little difficult to interpret, but the point I want to make here is the left-hand chord graph shows numbers of species moving from one part of the world to another. And by analyzing the data, we find that the main factor that explains the most variation in where one species, one part of the world moved to another is trade. And because these insects they're like other bark and wood-boring insects I was mentioning earlier, are accidentally moved in bark in wood packaging material. And you can see that there's, although again, it's hard to interpret these, but for example, the Palearctic and the Nearctic, that most of the species of damaging species of bark beetles we have in the Nearctic came from the Palearctic. And this can be you see that the same thing is true in terms of trade. Most of the historical trade that we have imported comes from the Palearctic. And most of these kind of patterns parallel each other with some variation. So in terms of understanding these global patterns of insects moving around the world, we can explain most of that variation based on historical patterns of trade, at least for insects like bark beetles, where the predominantly pathway is general trade. But it's also temporal patterns. Many of the temporal patterns we see in insect invasions are related to trade as well. And this graph shows, these lines here show numbers of non-native ants established in not just in the United States, but all over the world, the number of new ant invasions in different parts of the world. And you can see in both of these, we have these really interesting, these kind of two peaks of ant invasions. And these two peaks coincide with what economists call the two waves of globalization, that there was this pre-World War II wave of globalization, followed by the post-World War II wave of globalization. And this appears to have driven these two peaks of ant invasions, because we know, again, ants are another type of insect that are associated with general trade, because they're their general, what we call hitchhikers, that they just are stowaways in cargo. And so we have this general pattern of that imports, through time, imports and establishments seem to track each other. And so one question that comes out is, well, how can we use this to predict invasions in the future? Will we just keep having more and more invasions? And one of the key questions that's critical to answering that question is, well, what's the finite limits to the number of new invaders? And we refer to these as source species pool. That is, the pool of species out there in the world that are potentially new species that could invade new regions. And so it's easy to imagine that if we had an infinite or very, very large pool of potential source of species, then we could keep drawing from that pool via trade, and we would never deplete that or significantly deplete that pool of species. And so the number of establishments will just continue to increase at the same rate as we import goods. However, if there's a finite species pool and we start depleting that, then over time, we'll have some attenuation of number of new invasions as we deplete the sources of source species. And this is actually a concept that was initially recognized by Levine and D'Antonio in a kind of a classic paper where they, for several different organisms, they plotted cumulative number of establishments versus cumulative imports. And this is globally for I think actually this is for the United States. And this was both for mollusks, plant pathogens, and insects. And for all of these, you can see that there is a sort of attenuation phenomenon that really, and they recognize that the same phenomenon that that over time you essentially may be depleting the source species pool. And they attempted to model this, several different approaches to model it, but they found the best fit was using this Michaelis-Menten equation, which it's really not, the reason they chose it wasn't because the Michaelis-Menten equation is really an equation that's used for describing enzyme kinetics. And they didn't really recognize that the invasions really had anything to do with enzyme kinetics here, but it was really just a matter that the curve fit the data well, and so that's what they chose to model it. But in terms of predicting future invasions, the question arises, well, can we do better than just something like this Michaelis-Menten equation? But before doing so, there's really a key question, and that really has to do with, is there really a finite source species pool for insect invasions? And so to answer that question, it's interesting to look at some various pieces of information. One is the total number of insects in the world. No one really knows how many insects there are in the world, but the estimates are that there's maybe 1 to 30 million species, most of these undescribed. And if you say, okay, 1 to 30 million, in North America, we know that we've established somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 species. And so that is actually quite a small, even though 3,000 to 4,000 seems like a lot of insect species, it's actually a pretty small fraction of the total number in the species pool. And so from that perspective, we might think, oh, well, we aren't anywhere complete to depleting this source species pool. But if you start digging a little bit deeper, some of the information seems to change. So this is, again, going back to these true bark beetles, and you consider Europe. We know this is a group of insects that's actually quite well known, even though it's not really a huge group. And we know that in Europe, there are 85 species of bark beetles native to Europe. We've only introduced 8 of those 85 species. So again, from this perspective, we've introduced around 9% of them. So even though this is not indicating as much of a unsaturated species pool as my previous example, it still suggests there are a lot of species left to introduce. However, if you look at, there is other evidence that suggests that yes, we are depleting species pools. This graph shows numbers of, again, the true bark beetles, these introduced over time to North America. And you can see for the European Scolytines, we've sort of, it looks like we've reached some sort of saturation, that there are very few species of bark beetles have established in North America over the last century, even though we had quite a few established over the previous century. So these seem like slightly contradictory results. That some evidence suggests we have a large species pool, but this evidence suggests that we are depleting the species pool. So what could explain that discrepancy? Well, if you look at it, so again, using this example, the true bark beetles, we have 85 species native to Europe. We know we've only established 8 species. Well, of those 85 species, probably only a fraction of those are actually abundant in invasion pathways. And then only a fraction of those are highly invasive. So it's a much smaller fraction. And so the question is, well, how could we sort of model these sort of subsets? And I think the answer, the approach that we've taken to this is borrowing from community ecology, that basically in any insect or animal community, if you start taking samples, you'll find that there's always going to be a very large number of rare species and a very large number of rare species, and a very small number of very common species. And so this is something within community ecology, we refer to these as species abundance distributions. And there's a long history in community ecology of modeling these species abundance distributions. And so the question is, can we apply this concept of species abundance distributions to better model invasions based on the abundance of species in invasion pathways? So the question is, well, how do we, the idea basically is that within invasion pathways, we have the same patterns. There are some species, a very small number of species that are very, very abundant, and then many, many, many species that are rare. So the question is, how do we actually get data to actually model this kind of thing? And so what we turn to are port interception data that in the United States, like most other countries, we have biosecurity agents at ports, and their job is to inspect imports, looking for insects and other potentially damaging insects that might be entering, and with the idea of intercepting those species before they enter. Of course, the reality is with the volumes of trade, it's the impact of this inspection is actually pretty minuscule, and probably doesn't actually prevent species from establishing. But one of the key benefits from this kind of these inspections is it provides data on what types of species are entering and which are posing the most risk for invasions. And so we actually were able to use port interception data for, again, using these true bark beetles, data collected from 1984 to 2012, to actually get data on the abundance of different species in invasion pathways. So we took this data and we actually fit which again, this is a standard practice in community ecology. We fit a log normal distribution to model the abundance distribution of these species in the wood packaging pathway. And the key parameter in the log normal distribution is the standard deviation. We estimated a standard deviation of around 3 for these data. And just putting that in context, a standard deviation of 3 is actually compared to other in community ecology, would be considered quite a skewed distribution. That is a particularly large number of very common and many, many species of very rare species. So we used this estimate then of the species abundance distribution and put it together with other pieces of information with the goal of predicting future numbers of bark beetles in the future. And so the sort of second piece of information we used is a model that we had previously developed that relates propagule pressure with establishment. So if we know the propagule's pressure, the rate at which species are arriving, we know from the species abundance distribution. The idea is how we then take that information and translate that varying propagule pressure into a probability of a species establishment. And this was done, again, using historical information on historical bark beetle establishments in the United States, where we had somewhere, I can't remember, somewhere around 50 species of bark beetles that have established in the United States. And again, we used the numbers of interceptions as a proxy for their abundance or propagule pressure, and then basically use that information to model the probability of an individual species establishing as a function of the number of times that it was intercepted. And the idea is that the species that are intercepted more frequently, these are the species with greater propagule pressure, and these are the species that are more likely to establish. And we adopted a model that was previously a Weibull function that was previously proposed by Lung et al. To model establishment probability based on propagule pressure. We then used that model and then also predictions of future pathway rates, which were basically based on projections of future trade. So we basically just used a simple log linear model of imports to the United States and to make projections about future trade. This ISPM 15, which I mentioned before, which is phytosanitary treatment, which we know reduces propagule pressure. So we could actually make projections with and without ISPM 15. And then we basically, we fit this model over to data collected over about 150 years, where we have data on numbers of bark beetles established in the United States, just European bark beetle species established in the United States over the last 150 years. And we used a maximum likelihood procedure to fit parameters to this model using decadal time steps. And so this essentially is the model fit to the data. So again, the observed data are numbers of European bark beetles established each decade in the United States. And this first graph here shows the model fit using where we fixed our standard deviation of the log normal distribution, which I mentioned before was estimated from port interception data. The standard deviation of 3, and you can see it actually wasn't such a great fit. So we did the maximum likelihood estimation procedure again, but this time, instead of fixing the standard deviation of the log normal distribution, we allowed the standard deviation to vary, and we got a much better model fit, and with an estimate of around standard deviation of around 9. And this is an extraordinarily, standard deviation of 9 is kind of unheard of in community ecology because it's such a highly skewed distribution. And I think the reason for that highly skewed distribution is that it's really more, what we're really fitting is more just the frequency abundance distribution in the pathway, but it's also other characteristics that sort of are subsets of these species in the pathway, that there are only some species that are going to find hosts, only some species that are going to be successful at invading. And so this makes for an even more skewed distribution. When we applied this model to make predictions into the future, for a comparison point, you can see this pink line shows the Michaelis-Menten equation, which I mentioned before, which basically, it really forces this very flat curve to the data and really forecasts that in the future, there really won't be any more bark beetle invasions. And if we use the standard deviation of the log, log normal distribution of 3, it predicts this very high rate of invasion. And with probably the more accurate estimate of the standard deviation log normal of 9, we get what appears to be a more of a linear increase, continuation in the rate in which species will continue to establish in the future. So in other words, all this modeling exercise suggests that bark beetles will continue to establish at approximately the same rate in the future. And the sort of take-home message from this is that, yes, over time, as we import more and more material, we deplete source species pools, the best invaders, the most abundant species in invasion pathways establish, and we deplete invasion pathways. But because the rate of imports are always increasing through time, or at least historically they have, together these create a sort of linear, constant rate of establishment over time. And of course, for predicting the future, who knows, maybe the trend in globalization is finally going to stop, and we won't see this continued increase in imports over time. It's hard to know. So the last sort of chapter I wanted to talk about were some things about geographical patterns of invasions. And this is the slide that I showed earlier, which is the numbers of damaging non-native species of forest insects in the United States over time. And as I suggested before, when many people see this, we ask, well, why are there these patterns? And there are really probably two drivers of these geographical patterns of invasions in the United States. One is geographical variation in propagule pressure. We know that historically in the northeastern United States, historically there have been more people there, and so potentially greater propagule pressure. But another factor, which is probably also important, is invasibility. Again, this is for forest insects that feed on trees. And we know that this map here shows the number of tree genera in each county in the United States. And you can see in the eastern United States, forests are much more diverse. And because of that, there are essentially more opportunities for herbivorous insects to establish. And so we think that it's basically some combination of propagule pressure and invasibility that's driving these observed patterns. Well, how do you tease apart these patterns? Because it's not just these two factors, but many, many other variables that vary across space. And so the approach that we took to trying to model this was structural equation modeling, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's a great statistical tool for dealing with highly collinear variables that often exist in complex causal networks. And this essentially is the result of the structural equation modeling work we did on those data. And the sort of interesting take-home message is, when we look at numbers of pest species per county, the main driver of that appears to be numbers of host species in that county. A smaller negative effect was numbers of non-host species had a negative effect on pest richness. But we also saw a positive effect of human population density. So in other words, this is perhaps the effect of propagule pressure, where places where there are more people, there's more introductions, but the biggest driver appeared to be invasibility, specifically host tree species richness. And to explain this, I'm going to kind of sidetrack a little bit and try to understand, go back into a little bit about the literature on invasibility. And of course, people have actually been looking at invasibility, habitat invasibility for plants for much longer. And actually, the theory on this really goes back to Charles Elton back in 1958, and he had this diversity invasibility hypothesis. And he hypothesized that areas which are more species rich would be more resistant to invasions, because more ecological niches are occupied than in species poor assemblages. And this theory was really verified in the 1990s by some experiments that David Tillman carried out, where he actually worked with plants and manipulated plant diversity, and then studied which plant communities were more susceptible to invasions. And sure enough, he found that as plant diversity increased, the rate of invasion decreased, confirming the diversity invasibility hypothesis. Well, that has all been done with plants, but insects are very different, because for insects, we tend to think that competition is probably less important. And most insects are either herbivores or predators or parasites. And for all these species, their food webs, the crucial ingredient are host plants. And so for insects, in competition in the same trophic level is not so important, but it's really the diversity of plants that may be important for plant invasibility, for insect invasibility. And so this suggests something else, that what is referred to as the facilitation effect. That is, it's the exact opposite of the diversity invasibility hypothesis. Instead, the idea is that in places with high plant species richness are more prone to invasion, because there are actually more ecological niches than in places with species poor plant assemblages. And so you'd have a positive relationship between invasibility and plant diversity. But there's potentially another factor that could be going on, which is what we call the dilution effect. And that's the idea that in very species-rich plant assemblages, the host for an individual plant insect species might be difficult to find. And so because of that, the more species-poor plant assemblages might be more prone to invasion than the species-rich. So again, you might actually have these counteracting forces. That dilution would cause species richness to reduce invasibility, facilitation that causes a increasing resistance to invasion with species richness. And so teasing these apart are difficult, but again, with this data, county level data I showed before for numbers of pests by US county, we definitely see what looks like a positive effect of host species richness, tree species richness on pest diversity, and a declining negative effect of non-host. Again, sort of confirming these counteracting factors, and I guess explaining this pattern that we see in this structural equation modeling, where we have a positive effect of host plant richness and negative effect of non-host tree richness. So I'm just going to switch my gears in my last little chapter in my talk here and talk about another analysis that I've been involved with, where we've looked at, compared on a much larger spatial scale, looking at numbers of non-native species in different world regions. And some of these are generally very large regions, like numbers of species in North America, but also different islands, things like Okinawa, and a series of large number of islands from the southern hemisphere. So we have data on a total of 45 world regions where we have total numbers of non-native insects per region. And one of the things is a dubious source of pride that we can say proudly that North America, we appear to have the largest number of non-native species than any other world region, followed by the Hawaiian Islands, New Zealand, and Europe. And when looking at species richness of numbers of non-native species, to really understand this, you have to go back to the theory from really work back in the 1960s, when people were doing island biogeography. And it was recognized back then that these species area relationships, so basically the larger the land area, of course, the more species you're likely to be established in those regions. But we were interested in more than just land area. We were interested in taking these 45 different world regions and trying to understand what are the statistical correlates of the numbers of non-native insect species of numbers of non-native insect species in these regions. And actually, we had data both on numbers of non-native insect species and numbers of native insect species. And so we wanted to see how both propagule pressure would affect that, as well as invasibility. And propagule pressure, the main driver we thought were number of people. For invasibility, we thought it would be things like numbers of plant species would be drivers. And so this is a result. Again, we use structural equation modeling, and these things, I apologize, these things are kind of complicated, but the key information here, again, we were interested in numbers of non-native insects. The largest driver of that appears to be numbers of native plants. So again, native plant diversity drives more non-native insects, but also numbers of non-native plants also had an important impact on numbers of non-native impacts. Native insects, again, was predominantly driven by numbers of native plants. And the interesting thing here is occupants, number of people, at least at this spatial scale, we couldn't detect any direct effect on numbers of non-native insects. But we did have a strong effect of numbers of occupants, number of people on numbers of non-native plants. And this suggests this indirect impact of people affecting numbers of non-native plants, which then drives numbers of non-native insects. And so the kind of takeaway from this is that at these large spatial scales, plant diversity really plays a key role in determining habitat invasibility to insects. Another little sort of interesting side bit is that this may be a good example of this invasional meltdown concept, in that plant invasions seem to beget more insect invasions. So that's an interesting concept. So as sort of all big takeaway messages, I think, though, in terms of understanding overall temporal and spatial patterns of insect invasions, very often we're dealing with combinations of factors, drivers that affect propagule pressure, the rate at which species are being transported, but also habitat invasibility. And in terms of understanding invasibility, we're learning that plant diversity has a tremendous impact on invasibility to insects. And I think a really good example of this is provided by the spotted lanternfly, which, is sort of one of the latest great insect invasion disasters that's going on right now. And it's the ability of this insect to initially establish appears to have a lot to do with the abundance of a non-native plant in Ailanthus, which is one of its main hosts. But of course, it affects many, many other hosts. So I think it just does a good example of illustrating the role of plant invasions driving insect invasions. So that is my last slide. And Suzanne and Eric, do we want to, I guess I should stop sharing my screen, huh?
So please do join us on Zoom. And I'll be posting those Zoom link, and we'll continue the conversation there.
On predicting numbers of invasive, so in new invading species. So that's going back to the European to US, the continental type analysis. You said that you got a somewhat linear predicted increase in arrival of new species moving forward, which you said was a balance of exhausting the species pool balanced against the accelerated import volumes.
Yeah, about constant linear establishment, not arrival. Yeah.
So my question there is whether, if I think about trade flows globally of wood products, I would expect that the big signal may not just be accelerated import volumes from Europe. It may actually be a shift of where we're importing from, including to parts of the world where we've made less progress in exhausting that invasive species pool.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that's really an important point that I think, and that's, in fact, I didn't mention that, but I'm glad you brought that up, which is, it's one of the reasons why, even though I think that this depletion of species pools is going on, and this is not just for insects, probably for all kinds of organisms, even though we're depleting these source species pools, um, we don't, the numbers of new invasions don't necessarily attenuate because, for one thing, which as you pointed out, we keep changing where we're importing species from. So for example, in the prior to World War II in North America, we really didn't import much stuff from Asia. And then after World War II, we opened up Asia. And in fact, you can see that in that one graph I showed, that there really weren't many bark beetles established in North America from Asia until after, like from 1950s onward. And probably the same thing potentially could happen in different parts of the world. Maybe in the future, we'll start importing more stuff from Africa, and then that opens up these new species pools. And so as a consequence, instead of the numbers of species attenuating over time, they just keep going up. And of course, the other thing, in addition to opening up new species pools, we probably also open up new pathways. So as the technology of importation and the trade, the types of things that people choose to import from one part of the world to another changes over time, we're opening up new pathways. And so that also opens us up to a whole new pool of species. So yeah, I think it's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a key point that it's one of the reasons why, even though in sort of the background, I think this attenuation is happening, we just don't see it because of these other things that we're always opening up to new species pools.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how are you guys doing down there? So is the university stopping classes for the rest of the semester, or?
Sandy, it's Lou. Can you hear me?
Oh, Lou, how are you?
I'm okay. The university is going online for at least the rest of the semester, and for
Wow.
the mini term too. So I appreciate you taking the time out to join us for this. I caught part of this, but I was trying to stream it, and it hung, so I had to go to a different machine. I have a question about the effectiveness of the control methods. Were like 30 to 40% for this was, I guess, the wood ones mostly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what else can be done? Is there any really understanding as to what the holes are and why those methods, which seem pretty strong to me, are not really that effective?
Yeah. Well, it's a 30 to 50% reduction in the rate at which species are arriving. And you're right. It's kind of sad that these measures aren't more effective. You'd like to see like 100% effectiveness. But the reasons why, there are two things. One is sometimes the treatments are just not effective. Because like if it's a big piece of wood, the fumigants or the heat doesn't get the insects in the middle of the piece of wood. Sometimes people cheat. So in other words, that they say that they've treated it when in fact they haven't. And then the third thing is that sometimes the wood, even after it's been treated, there are certain insects that actually can colonize just dead wood.
Right.
It's already been sterilized, but then the insects can colonize it again. So all of those things kind of contribute. I mean, for the first two problems, people are working on solving those problems that of trying to figure out better treatments for treating the wood, but it's not an easy thing. And they're also working on devising better systems for compliance as well. But it is kind of fun though. Whenever you go to, I don't know if you've noticed you're in any kind of like, of course now we can't go to any stores, right? But if you go to someplace like Walmart or something like that, you'll see the pallets. They
Alex
have
all over.
the ISPM 15 stamp
Oh,
that
okay.
that shows that it's been, that pallet has been heat treated, or well, actually I think it actually will say HT or F depending on whether it's heat treated or fumigant, and then the first two letters show the country where it originated.
Oh, interesting. We did not. So you may remember that there was a group of undergraduates that were here at Nimbus for a project that produced a program with a lot of input with Dan Simberloff that would track the spread of wood pallets and other pallets by looking at trucking data in the U.S.
Yeah, whatever. I remember that. I remember
So,
I was in contact with them. Yeah.
yeah, they did a sort of tidy R code, and they won an award from the Nature Serve, from the Nature Conservancy. They all went to the meeting and gave a talk.
Cool.
But then it sort of stopped because I think we realized there were data limitations, and so it never formally got published.
Yeah, too bad.
But there's a website that's still there for
yeah, that's interesting. It'd be interesting. Maybe you can send me the link to it. I'd like to see it.
I'll resend you the link to that. Yeah.
I mean, it is actually kind of an amazing thing that it's like this. In fact, that's, of course, the other thing is that several people have suggested, well, maybe we should just ban wood pallets and wood packaging material. But I know, like in the US, there's actually a huge lobby of people, of companies that make pallets. And actually, Tennessee, they make a lot of pallets.
Oh, yes.
And
other wood products.
They really don't want that to stop. But some companies, like IKEA, no longer uses wood pallets. They use composite pallets that are made of just like basically cardboard.
I see.
And yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, there's this huge, the world movement of pallets. It's a really interesting thing that because most of the pallets are reused, just like shipping containers. They're reused, and then there are companies that basically lease the pallets to shippers. So it is a big database out there. If you could get, unfortunately, I mean, I think I've looked at like these companies that actually own these pallets. It would be really cool to get a hold of their data and like analyze where it all goes, but they don't seem to be really eager to give it up. So.
And putting chips on pallets to track them, GPS.
Oh, well, yeah, maybe you could do that too. So yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Sandy.
Yeah.
I want to know if any students, I know some students didn't get to ask questions at lunch because we had a short chat earlier. Do any of the students have any questions, or even students that weren't able to be there earlier today to hear Sandy talk about his job? Does anybody have any questions?
Oh. Suzanne, I can't hear you.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
Now you're back.
Yeah, but is everybody else?
I'll ask a very general question. So, hi, Sandy. I'm Mitchell. I missed this morning. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
But just, so what does your day-to-day look like? I mean, as graduate students, of course, we see our advisors and sort of what their day-to-day might look like and what being in the office is like. But I could imagine someone who works for the Forestry Service, that might be a little different.
Well, I mean, like most people, I probably spend 98% of my time sitting behind a computer. But in the office that I work in, I have a couple of technicians, and so I kind of interact with them on a daily basis. And but again, my existence, I'm probably a little, not maybe the average typical, although I don't know, it's hard to say. I mean, I think I mentioned, well, maybe you saw, I actually now spend I actually spend a lot of time not in my office, that I work, like I think I mentioned, I've spent 3 to 4 months a year working in the Czech Republic at a university there, where I have collaborations, and I have collaborations other places. So But I spend at least probably half my time here, and that's basically what I do is probably sit behind a computer all day and occasionally interact with my technicians, but and very occasionally I go out in the field. And
So on that very occasional time, what does field work look like for you or for a group similar to you and your work that you do?
Oh, well, I mean, I have a couple projects where, I'll go out and count. I actually have a project on the balsam woolly adelgid where I've been monitoring trees. They're in the Central Appalachians. There's a subspecies of balsam fir that's really being hammered by this balsam woolly adelgid, and so I've been monitoring those. But and yeah, so it's the nice thing about working with forest insects is you tend to do field work in nice places.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think when I was in graduate school, I have to admit that was part of my motivation. I had some fellow graduate students that were studying cotton insects, and wherever you grow cotton, I would say tends to not be so nice. And working with forest insects, if you work with forest insects, you tend to go to nice places. So that's why I chose forest insects.
Cool.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
Hi, Sandy. I had a question. Thank you for your presentation, by the way.
Sure.
So I was curious about the circular diagrams that you showed, showing kind of the pathways, the number of the pathways of invasions in relationship to the trade routes.
Yeah.
And I was curious if you had given any thought to, or whether you looked into kind of like climate matching, because I know that you showed Arctic had the highest numbers of invasions from the Palearctic and vice versa. But I was wondering if you had thought about any sort of climate matching, because in addition to trade routes.
Yep. Yeah, good point. In fact, that paper is just now coming out. We in fact, there's a third chord graph which shows climatic similarity between the regions, and and we actually fit a model that accounted for. In fact, I'd have to go back and look. I can't, but I know it definitely had cumulative trade and climatic similarity, and something about human population. I can't remember, but the biggest driver was the trade connection. But climatic similarity was generally tended to have an effect as well, which kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in fact, it's one of the interesting things in those things is the northern and southern hemisphere is that moving insects between the northern and the southern hemisphere, one of the things that sometimes is an impediment is that the climate is the opposite. When it's summer here, it's winter down there, and vice versa. And so that probably, even if the climates on average are kind of similar, it makes it more difficult to successfully, which is a good thing, to successfully move organisms between the northern and southern hemisphere. And then the other thing about the northern and southern hemisphere, which is kind of interesting, is that these large-scale biogeographic patterns that continents in the same, like for example, here, North America and Europe and Asia, we pretty much have all the same genera of plants, whereas the genera, in many cases, the families of plants between the northern and southern hemisphere are completely different. And so it makes it more difficult to translocate species. But on the other hand, people plant the same plants in the northern and southern hemispheres, so it kind of gets around that problem. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Sandy. It's Susan Michaelis.
Susan!
How are you doing?
Good.
Good. I'm wondering about the data that you showed that are showing the importance of the native and introduced plants in sustaining the invasion. And I'm wondering if the effort should be more on creating more blocks to importing plants than to worry about who's in the wood.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good,
that's what I think a lot of your data were showing, that it's sort of the bank of the host diversity that's there. Of course, propagule pressure and all those other things, but I'm really curious. And I remember at one of the meetings that we were together that those phytosanitary measures, both the treating of the wood and also quarantining the plants, isn't very rigorous in a lot of the stations, is what I was hearing from you and Eki and some of the others. So I'm wondering, like, is this anything that we can help or solve or work with?
Well, I mean, to be honest, in fact, I was really surprised at the strength of that relationship. And it definitely suggests that, that in a way it maybe strengthens the idea that planting alien plants is bad.
Right, absolutely.
Because it really suggests that it's really one of the main drivers of damaging insect invasions. And I really think, you know, and that's why I mentioned this thing about spotted lanternfly. There are actually a lot of other examples. If you start thinking about it, there are actually a lot of other examples of just sort of case studies where you can see, wow, here's this really bad damaging insect, and it really was able to get a foothold in this other part of the world because it was able to establish on an alien plant species. So it really, I think I mean, I'm not sure, you know, of course, in terms of actually changing policies and whatnot, it's always those, you know, obviously much more complicated, but it definitely, to me, it sort of highlights the importance of people being more cautious about planting alien plants, whether for landscaping purposes or forestry and that kind of thing. But
I know, I agree.
Yeah.
So Sandy, this is Lou again.
Yeah.
If we somehow could eradicate Ailanthus, you think that would actually, or has the species now become so established on other hosts that it wouldn't matter?
Oh, spotted lanternfly? Oh, yes. Yeah. It does quite well on a bunch of other hosts, but I think it does so well on Ailanthus that I think if Ailanthus hadn't been so widespread in the eastern United States, I think you could make a good argument that it might not have established. But
so if we were going to think of this as a kind of quarantine in space, as a spatial control problem, if you could create a cordon sanitaire by removing Ailanthus around where its current foci of infection is in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Is that a modeling problem?
Maybe. I mean, in fact, that's kind of the main management approach that has been taken for spotted lanternflies so far. Back when they were thinking they could eradicate it, they were basically trying to hack down as much Ailanthus as they could. The trouble is, there's a lot of Ailanthus out there.
Right.
So finding and killing it all is kind of difficult.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, no. But it is. I think it is an interesting modeling question, although it is complicated, and I think that the information about the suitability of Ailanthus versus other hosts, it's still, the biological information is sort of only partial.
I see.
So, yeah, okay. I think it's an interesting problem that even for spread of the lanternfly, I think that Ailanthus is definitely facilitating that. So.
Okay. So there's some spatial PDE control problems, Suzanne.
Yeah, maybe. Like railroad tracks. I don't know if, I always think railroads and highways are great Ailanthus habitats, and so they provide these kind of natural corridors.
Yeah, with a directed flow part to it. Okay.
Yeah.
That was the tree in the book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, if anyone read that.
Oh, it was?
Yeah. It was an ailanthus. It was a weedy invasive.
Huh. Okay, well, thank you. I think, anyway, this is like the third Zoom meeting today we had with Sandy for different purposes, so I really appreciate everybody coming and staying for questions. Is there one more burning question here or anything? Anyway, Sandy, we really appreciate
it. Thank you, Sandy.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. And
I don't know if we can like applaud. I haven't quite figured out how to do applaud.
Just unmute
Everybody has to turn off their mutes.
Right, do applaud. So.
Well,
right.
Thanks a lot. Actually, I'm going to say this actually worked pretty well. I have to
it
say.
Did. Thank you very much, Sandy. It was. We enjoyed it, and it worked very well. Also, thanks to Eric too. So, thanks to everybody.
Okay. Well, I hope none of you are too lonely and are able to all able to persist through this.
Yes, we hope to persist. That's important, right? Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.